Hello, my name is Nina Smith, and I want to tell you about my family's story that involves a court case that made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. I was in a documentary research class, and I decided to tell the story of Eli Keen and Phoebe Keen and their children. This was a story that my mother told me when I was younger.
I heard the story through Mom as a youngster, and then plus other relatives would always say, you all come from, they would say royalty, and you should act like that and hold your head up high, and you're not like the other children. We would hear that all the time, and so I always wonder, well, what are you talking about? And then Mom started telling us a story that she knew because she would show us the pictures of everyone. So that's how I heard about it.
I contacted historian Kimberly Schreck, who wrote an article that appeared in the Missouri Historical Review about the court case.
Eli Keen's father brought the family into St. Charles County in the late 1840s, and he died in 1850 and put all of his slaves up for sale at auction.
They settled on Missouri Point in St. Charles County. Eli and Phoebe lived together in what today we would call a common law marriage. Of course, in the 1850s, anti-miscegenation laws would not allow them to marry.
That prevented Eli and Phoebe from marrying was the prohibition against slaves' right to contract in anything. They can't contract in any sort of legal interactions, and that's what a marriage is. Eli, I think, believed that he could give her the right to contract in marriage, and therefore, if they stayed together long enough, their relationship would be legitimized by common law.
Eli and Phoebe lived together for 30 years and raised 9 children. In the early 1880s, Eli and Phoebe separated.
He ended up marrying his cousin Sophronia, and Phoebe just left and moved to St. Charles, and she did not want that, so she ended up getting her own place in St. Charles.
I suspect Phoebe left Eli when she learned he married his second cousin Sophronia.
Okay.
It was the same year. 1883 was when he married Sophronia, and he also purchased a home for Phoebe in the city of St. Charles.
Here's a 1905 map of St. Charles City, and on 6th Street, right here, is where Phoebe Keen lived the rest of her days after she separated from Eli Keen. This is the block where Phoebe lived after she moved off of Eli's farm. She stayed in this house until 1896 when she passed away. The house was deeded to Phoebe and meant to pass on to her daughters after her death. Eli traveled to West Virginia in 1883 and married a cousin, Sophronia.
Was a white woman who married her second cousin, Eli Keen, after he had raised 9 children with a slave woman, and they were all adults by the time he married Sophronia. There's Eli Keen, who, as far as all the white Keen relatives in Wood County, West Virginia know, is an unmarried man with a lot of property in the state of Missouri. So he's the obvious person to marry this woman and basically take her out of her sister's household.
Eli left 4 parcels of land, 1 for each son. Previously, Eli deeded the family farm and surrounding area to Phoebe. This property would be deeded to their 4 daughters after Phoebe's death. Eli bequeathed Sophronia the West Virginia estate, plus the rents and profits from 100 acres of farmland in St. Charles for the entirety of her natural life. 5 months after the death of her husband, Sophronia Keen filed a petition to contest her husband's will. I'm at the location where the St. Charles Courthouse used to stand. In 1902, the court case King versus Keen pertaining to the contested will was first heard here.
His wife, Sophronia, filed the first case in the St. Charles County Circuit Court to contest his will. The two sides focused on rather different issues. She was contesting it on the basis that the children who he left most of his estate to in Missouri had no legitimate right to inherit because their parents had never been married to each other. So they were, in the eyes of the law, bastards. Ellis's attorneys believed that if they could make a strong enough case that a common law marriage had existed between Eli and Phoebe, that their children's legitimacy would no longer be called into question. And there was no precedent that they knew of to suggest that that argument wouldn't work. Eli recognized his children as his beloved children who he wanted to take care of, and no amount of proof of that was enough to override the legal system's choice to mark those children as illegitimate because that served their agenda. After the Missouri Supreme Court rubber stamped the side saying that the children were illegitimate, and it went up to the US Supreme Court, who did not retry the case. They just remanded it, which means they looked at it and said, there's nothing new here. The decision of the lower court stands.
Even in the will, Eli says that if she contested the will, that any of her provisions would be null and void, but they stripped Eli of his voice.
This case made it possible for them to make sure that these 4 African American men whose white father tried to leave them a great deal of land in a valuable farming area, they would lose that land. They would lose that economic power that their father was trying to give to them.
Ellis, 70.61 acres. Reason, 150 acres. Mark, 100 acres. My beloved son, Matthew, he gave 108 acres. And his daughters with Phoebe also, they received 100 acres.
It's very expensive to take anything to trial. So the daughters who had inherited acreage and homes upon Phoebe's death were selling that off to defend their brothers' legal cases.
All the children did put money together to help with the case. So they also lost. It wasn't Ellis putting only his money in. The children were working with Ellis, and because Ellis had the education, they backed him up.
Okay.
So that's why he was presented as Sophronia versus Ellis Keen. Mm-hmm.
All of the children of Phoebe and Eli Keen suffered because they all put in as many resources as they could to fight these trials.
And it was so bad that even Sophronia, when she became ill, they had to take care of her. The same woman who took their property and their wealth, they had to take care of her because in her obituary, they described her as a good woman. They never said, well, she took our property. She took our wealth. We had to work for her and rent the property from her and give her the extra that we made off of it.
Right.
But, you know, they couldn't show that back then.
Right.
They couldn't show their frustration at all.
Just talking to some of my family members, they said these were children who were raised in wealth and then having all that stripped away, and they had nothing. So it's heartbreaking.
And they'd also experience a real moral smackdown by the courts to learn that land they'd been farming for 20 years could be taken away and given to some white woman from another state who they didn't know existed until their father was dying in bed in 1901.
Ellis became a very sad man because of losing the case. He was a very proud man. And then he ended up not caring for himself, you know, taking better care of himself. And you could see it down through the families as some of them became stewards and they were drinkers.
So how do you feel about the Supreme Court of Missouri ruling against the children and for Sophronia? What are your thoughts
It's a
on that?
terrible feeling. I mean, it's nothing new. It's the same thing that we go through often till today. It's really a sad situation that they had to go through that.
I imagine that someone comes in and takes it from you through the court system, and you no longer have the full riches that you were supposed to have. And then all of a sudden here's the attorneys and everyone else deciding that you can't have it because you're mulatto. That's what they said back then. And just, I can't imagine what they went through, and it had to be so terrible that the older people don't even want to talk about it anymore. But because of the times,
Right.
it wasn't going to happen.
The unjust economic treatment of Black people through the U.S. legal system lasted well over 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation.
But I think it's really important to think about the fact that who's in power, who gets to make rules, changes a great deal after the end of slavery. What was going to maintain the power structure that was most desired by the people who had the power and wanted to decide who kept the power? These were men who were concerned with what happens next outside of slavery. How are we going to keep the races separate? How are we going to keep the wealth and the power in white people's hands?
What happened to reparations? Why? If it said forever and ever on the will, and I know back in 1901 through 1905, the laws were different, but the government helped take the wealth from our ancestors. And that's so unfair because our grandfather, Eli Keen Jr., wanted it to stay with our family. And he put it in his will, and they totally took his voice away from what he wanted.
The I have a dream is not enough. It's time for us to stop dreaming and do something about it.